It's my pleasure to welcome back to Chautauqua Sunrise my colleague and friend James A. McQuiston, and he and I have been working together on a variety of projects, but today the focus is on Jim more than myself. And so, Jim, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always fun to be here.
I know.
Got a great crew here.
I know. And Jim, you told me a number of times you were done writing books, no more books on Oak Island, and never say never McQuiston. That's what I'm calling you now. So you wrote
Actually, that's how this book starts.
Never say never. What do we got
the latest.
What's the title of it? Well, let's do a close-up on that.
Oak Island and the Knights of Malta.
Knights of Malta.
It's a subject no one's ever looked into before, and I would like to say up front that, because we were talking about this earlier, I've written 11 books now on Oak Island. It's not for the sake of writing a book, it's for the sake of protecting the information that we found out, because I was finding a lot, and then like 5, maybe 6 books ago, you started chiming in.
Oh, it's all my fault.
And yeah, and if you just, you put the book out there, or I mean, if you only have a show like we have our Oak Island Plus or whatever, then all that information gets backed up on a hard drive and nobody ever hears about it again. So, you put it into a book, at least it's there, people can go buy it, people can have it in their library, pass it on to their kids or whatever. So how this book came about, we had a show, Oak Island Plus. Mm-hmm. We have it once a month, and I had ran into this guy up in Nova Scotia named Art Guinness, and he was sending me all these photos of walls and stone roads and everything, and his implication was that these aren't just on Oak Island. They talk about them all the time on Oak Island, but they're everywhere out in the mungy weeds of Nova Scotia. So there was a big history and a lot of buildings and whatever out there. And he happened to find this, what he called the W-shaped wall. You'll remember that day.
Yes, I do. I remember that, the W.
And it was a stone wall built, in a jagged shape like that. And so he said the funny thing about this wall is that it can't just be debris from a field, clearing
Mm-hmm.
it for crops, because he said it's on a hillside, it's all mucky down below it, and there's nothing's tillable there. So they built that for some other purpose. And he said, and it does look down over this place called Port Medway. And right away I go, Medway, W-wall, you spin a W around, you got an M, maybe it was made as an M to designate Port Medway. So we went on talking about all the other walls and everything. But then I got thinking about, well, what is Medway? What's the story behind Medway? Turns out it was Port Maltois, which was French for the Maltese, or Port of Malta or Port Maltese. And I'm like, wow, that's never been mentioned in any of the Oak Island shows. I've never read about it. I've read dozens and dozens of books on Nova Scotia. Never read anything about the Malta. So,
when you say Malta, what are we talking about? The island of Malta?
Yeah, and as it turns out, with just not, you went one way, I went another, and Art went another, and pretty soon we had all this information about the Knights of Malta being in Nova Scotia. Not only in Nova Scotia, but in the waters around Oak Island. And we thought, well, this is going to be a good show for our Oak Island Plus show. Turned out to be 2 episodes. We had so much stuff, and we had stuff left over. And so, once again, it was staring me in the face that we've got 2 hour-long shows worth, and we have another pile that's never going to see the light of day, but I could put it all into a book and try to condense it down. So that's what I did, and that's how this book came about. It was to preserve all that work that you and I and Art did. But basically, the bottom line is we found out that the Knights of Malta were leading the French effort to hang on to Nova Scotia, while the Scots were trying to, they named it Nova Scotia for New Scotland, and they were building castles and fortresses and things like that. And So through a treaty, it's a complex situation, but through a treaty, the French took it over, but they had to oust these renegade Scots, and they sent the Knights of Malta in. So you have the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia, which was the Scottish guys, and you have the Knights of Malta in this foreign land that's pretty much desolate, the vast majority of it, going at it for the country, to try to get the, control of the country. And this was nobody ever talked about. And so on the Oak Island, they talk about the Knights Templar all the time, and there's not one shred of evidence. There isn't one. I've never seen a shred of evidence that proves that Knights Templar were in America, let alone in Nova Scotia. But there's absolute proof, because we named them by name.
Yeah.
We found 2 absolute Maltese crosses. Everybody's familiar with that special, well, actually, it's right there on the front of the book, that special cross, Maltese cross. And, everybody's kind of familiar with that design. Actually, it's used for a lot of ambulance services.
Yeah, it's been around forever.
Because they were originally the Hospitallers, which meant they built hospitals for people during the Crusades, wounded knights. And so we found 2 of them, absolutely, and then we found 2 that appear to be that, but it would take like a trained geologist or somebody to look at that stone and decipher it, but we did a pretty good job, I think.
Jim, people are watching right now. We live in Chautauqua County. We're, 12, 14, 15 hours away from Nova Scotia. Why would anybody be interested in this story?
Like you and I?
Yeah.
Well, what got me started was my distant relative. His name is Sir Ian MacDonald McCuiston, and McCuiston is the Gaelic for McQuiston. He is the premier Knight Baronet of Nova Scotia. And I always knew that. I mean, I knew it since I was about 14 or 15, but I didn't know what it meant. I had no idea. And there was a phase where I actually emailed him a couple of times. But so I was watching, it was the 3rd episode, or the 3rd year of Curse of Oak Island. I hadn't watched the first 2, and I started watching it for all the big equipment. It was just so fascinating that they were tearing this island apart.
They still are, by the way.
Yeah, they still are. They're not a stone unturned 14 times, I think, by now. So I just was sitting there, and I thought, wow, Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia, Oak Island, Nova Scotia, I wonder if they have anything to do with each other. So I actually wrote them and said, have you ever found any of this information? No. Well, they called me for an hour. They asked a ton of questions. I started doing research for them. I'd send it to them. They'd ask more questions, and it just got to where literally there's been hundreds of emails, which isn't hard to believe because you did a tally of our emails for the last year and a half for the show.
Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds.
Well, not just the show, but the books you helped me with too. There's 700 or 800. Because you find out stuff and you want to share it right away in case the other person can ping pong off that and say, I'll look into that and see what I find.
Check this out.
Well, that was the way it was with them. And mostly it was with Doug Kroll from the show, sometimes Rick. So they said, well, after maybe 100 emails or more, a lady that used to work behind the scenes, she was like the mama of the whole situation up there. Nobody's ever known her, through TV. They've never seen her.
Right, behind the scenes.
She actually was in a split second in one show, and she didn't even know she was, and they told her, and she said, you're kidding. They had me in there? And I said, yeah, you just walked by the camera. But she was a genius, and she actually worked on the Nova Scotia part of the movie, The Titanic.
Oh, okay.
That was her biggest claim to fame, but she'd done a lot of other projects too. So anyway, she said, you know what, all this is just going to get lost. You got to write a book about it. Just stick all our emails and stuff, make sense out of them, get them a book. That was the first one. It continued on. She said the same thing about the second book. Well, then by the third book, I was getting so into this and was getting so much information. I said, I don't care whether they want me to write this next book. I'm writing it. We're creating volumes of real history. And that's what we kind of pride ourselves, and we say it all the time on our show, but we look at actual documents. That's probably the driving force. Now we look at family connections, who was the son of who, and whatever, but we've been lucky to find some primary source documents, which means a contemporaneous letter or a papal edict that was, or something that the king, or the Privy Council minutes. That was happening at the time that the history was happening.
And we're talking 1600s here.
Yeah. And well, in fact, some of the papal bulls about the Templars and the
even
the Knights
earlier.
of Malta went all the way back to 1312, I think. So we're thrilled when we find one of them, but we also find books that were written pretty much contemporaneous, or maybe within a generation of when the event happened. And we've looked at what they call First Nations. There would be our Native Americans. They call it First Nations, Mi'kmaq. In fact, you've done a lot of research on that someday we're going to do something on that. I mean, we got research piled up everywhere. But so it's actually, the chore is not to find the information. The chore is to sort through the information to figure out how can you present this in a way to the people that makes sense in a logical way. We don't jump around. We're not doing quick head turnings and leaving people with the suspense and all that. We're just saying,
No
hey,
cliffhangers.
these are the facts, and here's where we got the facts from.
So let me go back to my question. So, true or false, the history of Nova Scotia and the history of America are connected?
Oh, yeah. Especially
And
New
that's why I
England.
think it's important. A lot of people don't realize this. Barb and I just got back from Maine, and I saw names in roads and towns that had the names of the Scots, of the British, that went back to the 1600s. And as we're going through there, Barb is probably, oh, really? And I'm going, look at this. This is Arundel, and this is Cromwell, and this is. And we were only a few hours away from Nova Scotia. So Nova Scotia originally was sort of part of the United States, not the United States, because we weren't the states
Part of the
then.
colonies,
The colonies,
yeah.
right? Am I right?
Yeah, and then even after the Revolution, it went on for a dozen or maybe 3 dozen years where they would go back and forth. Does it belong to the United States? Does it belong to Canada? Because when they drew the line, it physically landed in Canada, but a lot of the people were the same related people from New England, particularly from Cape Cod. It's kind of like they call them the Maritimes, from Cape Cod up around Boston and then on up into Maine and into Nova Scotia. And why everybody wanted it was because it was kind of the gateway to everything. You came across from Europe, you could go up around Nova Scotia and go down the Gulf, or go up the Gulf, the St. Lawrence River, and get up to Lake Ontario and Lake Erie and whatever.
In Ripley.
Yeah, in Ripley.
right into Pennsylvania.
And northeast where I
Yeah,
live.
yeah.
Or you could come around the front and go down to Cape Cod, and you could go all the way down to the Virginia colony. You could go down to Bermuda and places like that where they were making rum. They were taking goods down there and bringing rum and sugar and things like that back up, back and forth. So it was an absolute gateway and very valuable. So everybody wanted it, and that we've kind of came to this conclusion that they have really strict treasure trove laws there. And when 2021 came along, that was their 400th anniversary of the name of Nova Scotia. They never had any substantial celebration of it. And what it appears has happened is that there's been enough cultures there. You have the Mi'kmaq, you have the French, you have the Scots, you have the British, which is separate from the Scots. And then other groups, particularly the Germans, came into Lunenburg, and the Irish came in. A lot of Irish came in, and so if you honor one, you might be stepping on the other person's culture.
Yeah.
Or if you start digging in your backyard, which you're not allowed to do there, you start digging in your backyard and you find some artifacts. It could be somebody else's culture that you're destroying, I guess you could say. And that's exactly what happened on Oak Island. They got shut down in 2021 over the find of Mi'kmaq items near that stone road, right next to European artifacts, which led us to believe they were trading beaver pelts there, because that big beaver area there. But so they shut the whole island down. and I was up there. I got up there a couple of days after it happened. Two of the guys, Craig and Marty, had left for back to Michigan, kind of a little ticked off, and Rick was down. Everybody was down, and it was heavy COVID restrictions.
Oh,
I
yeah,
thought,
yeah.
it's just COVID. Everybody's just down from COVID. Nope, they were down because they got shut down.
Yeah.
The only place they could dig, like Laird told us. We had Laird on the show. It was a great show.
Yeah.
I think it's the top show ever.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
20-some thousand people.
Yeah.
And but he said that the only place they could dig was the money pit area because it's been dug so many times that there can't possibly be any in situ, they call it, cultural items there.
Yeah.
In situ just means nobody's touched it in recent years or whatever. But it could be in other areas. So it's gotten so restrictive that people in their own backyards can't dig. And we just did a show on the New Ross Castle, and the people that own that said, if we accidentally find a really cool artifact and we tell somebody, we're liable for an archaeological study, which is about $2,000.
Oh, boy.
And she said, so what happens is nobody tells anybody.
Yeah.
If they find it, they say, "Oh, I'm gardening. I'm doing some gardening," and they have a little
Just happened to
box
find
they
it.
put it in, But they don't do anything at theirs. They're trying to protect.
Jim,
it.
I'd like to focus back on the Knights of Malta, and let's roll the tape back a little bit. So people got to imagine North America, Nova Scotia area, and it's a time of exploration, right?
Absolutely.
You got the Spanish going down into South America. You got the Portuguese all over the place, and I guess you say the Scots and the Brits, they wanted to get some of the action.
Yep.
And so they started getting into North America and into the Nova Scotia area. And so they had different explorers at some time, but then there was this guy named William Alexander, right?
Yep.
And he had a dream, and he created a group of guys, investors I call them, called the Knights Baronet. They have hardly ever talked about that, and we have reams of information about these guys, Knights Baronet. At the same time, and this is how we get to where we're getting to right now, you got this other group of people that are being formed in France called the Knights of Malta.
Right. Well, the Knights of Malta had already been found, but they were used to lead
Right.
what was called the 100 Associates.
Right.
And what happened was Alexander had formed his Knights Baronet in 25. And 2 years later, Cardinal Richelieu, which anybody reads Alexander Dumas books
Yeah.
or anybody knows who he was the right-hand man to Louis XIII. He formed an identical group. It was, each group had 100 men. Each group paid 3,000 particular units of money for it.
Pounds or
Each
whatever,
one
yeah.
would get land, ultimately get land. He just didn't call his knights. They were just called associates.
Right.
But he was following the lead of William Alexander, and so it came to a head over there because, for one thing, there was, again, I mentioned the beaver trade. It was incredible, and that was a big, big business, but also lumber because
England
those
had
Euro-
depleted their resources.
between fires, wars, building ships, building buildings, burning it to keep warm. It was terrible. And you go to Scotland now, there's the only trees you see are usually tree farms. Most of it's just barren. So when they saw this whole place where you can get all this lumber for free, and then they always had they were following the Spanish and Portuguese, hoping they were going to find El Dorado or something.
Yeah.
They never
Gold,
did. They
gold.
did find some. Took them to get all the way over to Yukon before they found the big mother lode. But they were always looking. In fact, the river that goes from Oak Island up to New Ross is called Gold River for a reason. They panned for gold, or however they, how sophisticated they got, I don't know.
All right, so William Alexander, he names Nova Scotia,
Yes.
Nova Scotia for New Scotland.
New Scotland.
And that's 1625 to what?
Well, they got booted out in 1632 by the Knights of Malta.
Why?
Well, because Charles I of Britain
Yeah.
was the brother-in-law of Louis XIII of France. He had married his sister. Along with the sister was supposed to was supposed to come a dowry. He only got half of it up front.
Okay.
Louis didn't have any money, so he couldn't pay it. And Charles didn't have any money, and he was desperate. So he made a deal with Louis that I'll give you back Nova Scotia if you give me that other half of the money.
He gave Nova Scotia to France over a marriage?
Yeah, and a half of a dowry.
I think France made out on that deal.
Yeah.
For a while, anyways.
And the funny part about it was that, and we found this for our last Oak Island Plus show, that even by the very next year, the king met with Parliament and William Alexander and the Knights Baronet and said, don't worry, you're not being kicked out of Nova Scotia. And they're like, what do you mean? We just got kicked out of Nova Scotia.
And they've invested millions of dollars at that point.
Millions of dollars in our
I own 15,000 acres in Nova Scotia. Now you're telling me it's not mine?
And for centuries, all the way up to today, they've been trying to get some kind of compensation for it. In our show, we read all the different episodes that we could find where they would meet. They'd meet with Parliament. They'd meet at Edinburgh.
So they're laying claim to land in Nova Scotia to this day.
Because as you read it in our episode, the verification that they owned that land was about this long, and it covered every aspect that could possibly happen in history that was their land. But whoops, it wasn't their land all of a sudden. So they've been fighting for it because, there was probably a lot of that. It was a lot of chiefs from the clans, and they were probably spending a good majority of the clan's finances on it. Everybody wanted to get out of the old world.
Okay.
They literally did. There were 3 popes. At one point, 3 people claiming to be pope. There were the Black Death, which took a third or 2/3, I think, of every European, something like that.
Millions of people.
There were fights over who was king, this cousin's fighting that guy, whatever. As resources dwindled, the clans were fighting each other. Clans that had the same blood, but there just wasn't enough to go around, and it was just a terrible situation. William Alexander referred to it as vexations of the old world. And they saw this land of opportunity, endless acreage, trees, to build with.
Okay.
Nova Scotia's like 95% stone. I mean, you go around that place, there's
That's true.
rocks everywhere, so they can build a nice castle or whatever pretty quickly.
Okay. So the Alexander gets these guys to invest. The king marries the French girl and gives Nova Scotia back to France. And then what happens? So how does the Knights of Malta play into all this?
Well, the original group of French that went over there, they actually went over earlier than the Knights. They got there in 1604. They were under the auspices of a Knight of Malta who Richelieu entrusted with this project.
This is before the Scots.
Yeah, before the Scots.
Woo.
And but it didn't take solidly, and the English attacked them quite often, trying to hold them back. And so when it looked like the Scots were going to get a pretty firm foothold, they got another Knight of Malta, Isaac de Razilli. And they sent him over, and he landed just below Mahone Bay where Oak Island is. And that was his headquarters, or he actually built a fort
And when
there.
was this?
He got there in 1632. Yeah.
Okay. And so he's charged the job to get the Scots out.
Well, the original group, or the majority of the group, left on their own because they were presented with an edict from both kings. So he said, all right, well,
All right, so the Scots are told,
yeah.
you're out of here.
So that was in April. But 50 of them stayed behind, roughly 50. And they said, no way. We got our, this is our American dream. You're trying to take it away from us. So they actually raided a French trading post to get their furs and get their food, whatever. And they were kind of like, it was like, I think you called it the Old West. It was like the Old West. There was no sheriff in town, and everybody's doing what they had to do. And so Razilli had a specific charge from Cardinal Richelieu, go get those Scots and get them out of there. Well, they came over with 300 men. So these 50 guys, like, okay, we're going to die or we'll just go back home. they're always looking for the easier choice, and going back home was easier. So they provided a ship, and they sent them all back to Great Britain. And then they took total charge of Nova Scotia for a while.
But it was a peaceful transition, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that one of the reasons it was peaceful was because they had no choice. I mean, when
Yeah.
you're, if it's, what would that be, 6-1, 300 or, yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, so you're like, okay, they're going to kill us, or we'll get on their ship and go home, you know.
But did some of these Scots like disappear into the woods?
Well, actually, there were, I think, at least 5 families, they know their last name, their surname, that stayed, and they generally married into the Mi'kmaq. And so that was their sort of cover, like, okay, I'm going to be peaceful, I'm with the native group here, and
Yeah.
just don't kill me, you know, type of thing. But so some Scots did, but when there were a lot of battles through those, like I'd say the next century, but Britain took control very strongly in 1749, and they established Halifax. And at that point, there was no question. They had the greater forces. So now, you know, it's just basically who had the bigger army was what it came down to. And so ever since roughly 1749, but in that time span, they've controlled it. And there's been still battles with the French, and they actually exported a lot of French. They call it the Acadian
Down into
to
Louisiana.
Louisiana, yeah.
Yeah.
But but it didn't keep Knights Baronet families from coming back, because once you could get back there, first of all, the Halifax Masons, we've found their roster, and it reads like the Knights or the Knights Baronet roster, same exact names.
Right.
There was a Knight Baronet that was a governor of Nova Scotia at one point. There was one that was the governor of Prince Edward Island, which is a fairly nice island just off the coast. And there was one of New Brunswick, which New Brunswick was broken off from Nova Scotia. And so they actually got their foot that far into the door coming back. And there was almost certainly a Knight of Malta, 7th in line, or Knight of Nova Scotia, 7th in line on Oak Island. He was the uncle of John Smith, one of the 3 guys that dug up the money pit. So they weren't leaving it alone, and they were having these meetings in Scotland with the king, saying, you know, your ancestor, who you got the throne from, told us we had this land, and we paid him all this money, and we want our land. And so, you know, it's been an ongoing battle, and it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but there seems like enough evidence that there has been a cover-up, that they don't want, there's so many millions of dollars involved, plus other people have settled on that land. So what do? Go to those people and say, hey, 400 years ago somebody owned this, so you got to get off now, you know. Some of it could be downtown Halifax.
Yeah.
I don't know, you know, and so I read recently, and I wished I could find that source again, but it said that they had petitioned the British government and said there's a lot of barren land in Nova Scotia. Give us a chunk of that at least,
Yeah.
to satisfy our deed. And that barren land is actually where our friend Art
Yeah.
spent a lot of his time hiking, and he'd be like, there's no farms or anything around here, but look at this stone road that goes up. There's a stone well at the end of it. And he actually looked at LiDAR charts. He just did a bang-up job of.
Okay, so you had the Knights Baronet, who were the Scots that tried to colonize Nova Scotia area, Anacostia Island, part of south of Quebec, I think, and New Brunswick, and that whole area, right? And then, as according to what we're saying here, is then the land was given back to France, and these guys, these 100 gentlemen that were investing in France there with Cardinal Richelieu, he sends the Knights of Malta to be the strongmen, right? So what in the book are salient points? What did the Knights of Malta do? What, you know, did they colonize the area, or what did they do?
Their leader, Razilli, he unfortunately passed just 4 years later after he got there. But the first thing they did was drive the Scots out. Then they took over their communities. They actually, and we've found this phenomenon, where they wouldn't just move into their fort to tear their fort down, or actually they'd make them tear their fort down,
Right.
and they'd
Burn
build their own fort for some crazy reason. But he explored all up and down. Now, first I have to say that Samuel de Champlain, which is a very common name, he was involved in all this too, but he wasn't a Knight of Malta, and because he was born a Huguenot. Whether he changed to Catholic or not, you have to be a Catholic to be a Knight of Malta. He moved up to Quebec, and so Razilli, they actually appointed Razilli as the lieutenant of all of it, lieutenant governor
And he's
of
the
whole
French
thing.
Knight of Malta.
But he comes over and says, I'm not going to try to step into Champlain's foot. He's famous throughout Europe anyway, and he knows this like the back of his hand. So if he's willing to stay up in Quebec and French Canada, I'll just take Nova Scotia and look over Nova Scotia. But without his leadership, there's the only other person that stands out too much is there's two, Charles de Latour, the Latour family, or his Razilli's lieutenant, Nicholas Denis. Well, what's cool about Denis, it's Denys, he wrote a lot. So did Champlain and so did Razilli, but Denis really wrote a lot, and he wrote about them going into the bay where Mahone Bay is, talking about islands, specifically telling stories about islands, going up to Gold River and actually checking the depth of it, and he said something about how far up it would be deep enough for a boat. Well, how would he know unless he went up that far?
Right.
So they were actually going up Gold River that heads to
All right,
New
so
Ross.
if you're at the end of Gold River, right at the
Oak
very
Island.
end, across the bay is Oak
Okay.
Island.
It Gold River comes down on an angle based on the landscape of the mainland, and it comes right like this and wraps right around Oak Island. So if you were, for instance, he said that the Mi'kmaq would bring the furs down from up around New Ross. Why go to another island? Why not go to the first island that you come to? You
There
come
it
right
is.
down here, go right into the island. And actually, I didn't think about this before, but I bet you could almost make a trajectory of that stone road that would run up Gold River.
All right.
So they come down there, they have a stone road, the big ships come in, they get a tender off the ship, a smaller boat, come up as far as they can, they bring the oxen out. Carmen Legg was on our show, he told us how they could be all the way up to their shoulders, didn't bother an ox at all. So they go take them out, load up the carts with European cloth or beads or whatever, trading items.
Food.
Bring it up to, food. Bring it up to the stone road, and here come the Mi'kmaq with their canoes full of beaver pelts, right up to the stone road. On this side of the stone road is where they found the Mi'kmaq stuff. And when I was up there, they had a giant dig. It was bigger than the stone road, but it went off on an angle. And right over here was all remember there was a couple broken up barrels. There was a trading weight. The 1632 T-square.
Yep.
That was one of my favorite moments. I wasn't on the show at that point, but they found a T-square in a swamp, which this is where the stone road is. And so I was just chomping at the bit, because it was wooden, for Craig to bring in the carbon dates, because he does all the carbon dating, or he's a go-between.
Yeah.
And he's picking up all these items, blah, 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 blah. Then he picks up the T-square. This goes back to 1632. And they show everybody going,
That's fair enough.
they had to go, and I'm like, that's
It's
my
right,
year.
it's right in the pocket of what we've been talking about.
Yep.
So if I can summarize what I'm hearing you say, is that Oak Island was sort of like a depot. It was a trading center. And that it wasn't necessarily, it could have been, but it wasn't necessarily for transport. This road wasn't for necessarily moving treasure, but it was used for utilitarian purposes.
Yep.
We even thought that the road could have been used for drying fish, right?
Or driving the furs.
Furs,
they would
whatever.
put them out,
So, Jim, we're down to a couple minutes. So I want you to tell folks why they would want to maybe read this book, where to find it, and just some key points in the book that are kind of cool.
Well, if you're interested in early North American history or knights, papal established knights like the Knights of Templar, Knights of Malta, but it tells history about Nova Scotia and, which also relates to Oak Island, that is not told anywhere else. Art he actually approached the Knights of Malta of Canada, got information. You got information. You found that hermstone at the museum. I got information. So we have three guys pulling information into one pool, trying to make sense of it. We had two museums help us out. It wasn't just me, and I say that in the book. It wasn't just me. It was a team that discovered this. And literally, you will not find this anywhere in the world. I don't care. You can look at any library anywhere. You will not find this information. Now, a lot of my books borderline on that, but nobody even ever mentioned the Knights of Malta on the show or anywhere until until Art found the M wall, and then we took it from there. And
where do you find this book?
It's on Amazon. All my books are on Amazon under my name. I've got 11 Oak Island, and I have one on just the Knights Templar, Knights of Malta, Freemasons, and a bunch of other books too. But they're all on there, and I make them all the same size. So when you put them on your library shelf, you got 11 books, or if you want to buy other ones, they all match. And
guess what? We're done.
Okay. Well, I knew we could fill up the time.
Folks, I hope you enjoyed a little history and a look back in the past of this area. And remember, the Oak Island story is also our story, as Jim has pointed out very eloquently. Jim, thanks for joining us today. And if you want to see more information, go to YouTube, look up Oak Island Plus, go to the Facebook page, Oak Island Plus, and you see a lot of Jim's work and my work and Art's work there as well. We're going to do this all again next Saturday, and have a lovely last day of summer, and we'll see you next fall. Take care now. Bye-bye.